I never expected a warm welcome when I showed up at my sister's lavish engagement party after 9 years of being cut off from my family. Still, my mother's hostile greeting hit like a slap. "Why is this failure here?" she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. My sister Audrey smirked, scanning me from head to toe. "You are not on the guest list," she said coldly. My father didn't even speak. He simply looked past me as if I were invisible, a ghost at their perfect celebration. Instead of retreating, I smiled confidently and said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I own the venue now. And there's something all of you need to know." 9 years earlier, my life had been completely different. At 22, I was a promising art student with a full scholarship at Westridge University, one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. My portfolio had won national competitions, and my professors saw potential in me that made them invest extra time in my development. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. My family had other ideas. The Harringtons were known for their wealth status and multi-generational success in finance. My father, William Harrington, ran an investment firm that catered to the elite, and he had always made it clear that both his daughters were expected to follow in his footsteps. "Art doesn't build legacies, Elsie," he would say, his disappointment evident. "Finance builds empires." My sister Audrey had always been the perfect daughter. 3 years older than me, she had graduated with honors in finance, joined our father's firm, and was quickly becoming his protégé. She wore the right clothes, said the right things, and never questioned the path laid out for her. Where I was creative and questioning, Audrey was practical and compliant. Our parents rewarded her accordingly. "I don't understand why you insist on wasting your potential," my mother Caroline would sigh during holiday dinners. "Your sister already has a corner office and clients who trust her with millions. What will you have with your paintings? A studio apartment and ramen noodles." I tried explaining that success looked different to me, but they couldn't or wouldn't understand. Still, they were my family. Despite our differences, I loved them and believed they wanted what was best for me, even if we disagreed about what best meant. Everything changed during winter break of my senior year. I had come home for Christmas, and my father asked me to help organize some paperwork for the annual tax filing. "At least put those detail-oriented eyes to good use," he joked. It was one of the rare moments when he acknowledged that my artistic perspective might have value, so I eagerly agreed. As I sorted through statements and receipts, I noticed inconsistencies. Transfers between accounts that didn't match declared investments. Client funds that disappeared into offshore accounts before reappearing months later with inexplicable increases. At first I thought it was my lack of financial knowledge, but after 3 days of organizing, patterns emerged that couldn't be explained by legitimate business practices. When I brought my concerns to my father in his home office, his reaction startled me. His face flushed crimson. "You don't understand how business works at this level." He dismissed me, snatching the papers from my hands. "These are sophisticated investment strategies beyond your comprehension. Stick to your paints and canvases, Elsie." "Dad, I might not be a finance major, but I can see when numbers don't add up," I insisted. "Some of these clients' money is being moved without proper documentation. That's not a strategy, that's enough," he thundered, slamming his fist on the desk. "You think a few art classes make you qualified to question how I run my business? A business that pays for your expensive education and lifestyle?" Unknown to us, Audrey had been standing in the doorway. She entered, her expression tense but controlled. "Elsie," she said evenly, "you need to drop this right now. You have no idea what you're meddling with." "I'm not meddling, I'm concerned," I replied. "If these transactions aren't legitimate—" "They're perfectly legitimate," my father interrupted. "And this conversation is over." Later that evening, I approached my mother in the kitchen, hoping she might listen more openly. "Mom, I think Dad might be doing something unethical with client funds," I whispered, checking to make sure we were alone. She barely looked up from the dinner preparations. "Stop causing trouble, Elsie. Your father has built this business over 30 years. Who are you to question his methods?" Her dismissal hurt more than my father's anger. She had always been my buffer, the one who at least pretended to understand my choices even if she didn't approve. Unable to let it go, I spent the next few days researching financial regulations and scrutinizing the documents I had access to. What I discovered was worse than I initially thought. My father wasn't just bending rules. He was systematically embezzling from his clients' accounts, using a complex shell game to hide the theft. He would take money from newer clients to pay returns to older ones, a classic Ponzi scheme that could collapse at any moment. When I gathered enough evidence, I confronted my family together in the living room. I laid out printouts of transactions, highlighted regulations, and explained what I had found as calmly as I could. I expected shock, perhaps denial, but what happened next destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. "You're going to turn me in." My father laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your own father, I don't want to," I said truthfully. "But what you're doing is wrong. People will lose everything when this falls apart. We need to come clean, make restitution." "There's no we here," Audrey interrupted. "This is you once again thinking you know better than everyone else." My mother simply stared at me with cold disappointment. "I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing," I pleaded. "If you don't, I'll have to report this to the authorities." My father's expression changed then from anger to something calculated. He exchanged a look with Audrey that sent chills down my spine. "You've always been the problem child, Elsie," he said quietly. "Always thinking you're so special, so morally superior. But you've made a serious mistake this time." 3 hours later, police officers were at our door. They had a warrant to search my room where they found our family's missing heirlooms, antique jewelry, worth thousands of dollars that had disappeared over the past year. Heirlooms I had never seen before. That moment planted in my closet while I was continuing my research in the library. My family had moved with breathtaking efficiency to discredit and eliminate me. The police handcuffed me in our foyer as my parents watched with perfectly crafted expressions of sorrow and betrayal. "We've been missing items for months," my father told the officers, his voice breaking convincingly. "We never wanted to believe it was Elsie. She's been troubled. We've tried everything to help her." My mother dabbed at non-existent tears. The pressure of school must have been too much. She's always been jealous of her sister's success. "Elsie," I said desperately to the officers. "My name is Elsie Harrington. I'm a student at Westridge University. I found evidence that my father is embezzling from his clients. This is a setup they're framing me because I threatened to expose them." The officers exchanged glances that told me exactly how crazy I sounded. Audrey's performance was the most convincing. With genuine-looking tears streaming down her face, she stepped forward. "We've been covering for her for years," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Small things at first, money from Mom's purse, Dad's watches. We thought she'd grow out of it, but it kept escalating." She looked at me with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "I'm so sorry, Elsie. I can't lie for you anymore." I spent the night in jail, my mind reeling. By morning, my parents had decided not to press charges, a mercy that only reinforced my apparent guilt. Instead, they publicly disowned me, declaring that despite years of therapy and support, I had chosen a path of deception. The scandal spread quickly through our social circle. My parents were viewed as tragic figures dealing with a troubled, ungrateful daughter who had betrayed them. Within days, the damage was catastrophic. Westridge University reviewed my scholarship after receiving calls from concerned donors, including my father. The review concluded with the revocation of my full ride. Without financial support, and with my reputation destroyed, I couldn't continue my education. The promising future I had worked toward vanished overnight. I tried applying for loans or financial aid at other schools, but my father's influence in banking circles ensured rejection after rejection. His connections were thorough and merciless. Friends I had known since childhood stopped returning my calls. Extended family members who had once praised my artwork at family gatherings now crossed the street to avoid me. The isolation was complete and deliberate. With no support system and no resources, I was forced to leave town. I packed what I could fit into a backpack, mostly clothes and a few art supplies, and bought a bus ticket to Seattle with the last of my savings. I chose Seattle purely because it was far away and large enough to disappear in. Those first months were the hardest of my life. I slept in shelters when beds were available and in parks when they weren't. I found work washing dishes in restaurants and stocking shelves overnight, but minimum wage jobs barely covered food, let alone stable housing. My art supplies remained untouched in my backpack, There was no time or energy for creativity when survival consumed every waking moment. One rainy afternoon, about 6 months after my exile, I was sitting in a public library using their computers to search for better job opportunities. Curiosity and a lingering hope made me search for my family online. What I found felt like a second betrayal more profound than the first. They had erased me completely. Recent family photos showed only my parents and Audrey posed and smiling as if I had never existed. Older images where I couldn't be cropped out had been removed from social media and the company website. My mother had given an interview to a local lifestyle magazine about raising a successful daughter, singular, not plural. There was no mention of a second child. With trembling fingers, I called my childhood friend Stephanie, using a library phone. "Steph, it's Elsie," I said when she answered. A pause. Elsie Harrington." "Yes," I said, relief washing over me. "I know we haven't talked in months, but this is inappropriate." She cut me off, her voice chilly. "The Harringtons lost their daughter in a tragic accident abroad last year. I don't know who you are or what you want, but this is cruel and disgusting." She hung up before I could respond. They had declared me dead. While I struggled to survive, my family had created an elaborate fiction of a tragic accident receiving sympathy and support while I slept on benches in a city 3,000 miles away. That night, huddled in a shelter bed, I realized the full extent of what had happened. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had systematically destroyed every trace of my existence to protect their reputation and my father's criminal enterprise. I was not just unwanted. I was unmentionable, unpersoned, erased from family history as thoroughly as if I had never been born. Something broke inside me that night, but something else was forged in its place. I would survive. I would rebuild. And someday, I would return to reclaim my truth. Winter in Seattle was brutal for someone without proper housing. By December, I had developed a persistent cough and lost so much weight that my clothes hung on my frame. I was working at a coffee shop, having finally secured a slightly better job than dishwashing, but still making barely enough to eat. One particularly slow afternoon, a customer left behind a sketchbook. I flipped through it looking for identification, and instead found page after page of gallery layouts and exhibition designs. When he returned 20 minutes later, I had the book waiting. "Thank you," he said, visibly relieved. "My entire next season is in here." He looked at me more carefully. "Are you an artist?" "You were looking at those layouts with a pretty critical eye." Something made me answer honestly. "I was an art student. Before." His name was Tanner Wilson, owner of a small gallery called Aperture in the Arts District. Our conversation lasted through his second coffee and ended with an unexpected offer. "My assistant manager just gave notice. It's nothing glamorous, mostly scheduling inventory, some customer interaction. But it's full-time with benefits, and you'd be surrounded by art again." 2 weeks later, I moved into a tiny studio apartment above the gallery. It had been a storage space that Tanner converted into basic living quarters. A bed, bathroom, hot plate, and mini fridge. But after months of instability, it felt like a mansion. The position paid enough to cover food and necessities, with rent deducted as part of my compensation. I threw myself into learning every aspect of the gallery business. While my art background helped me understand the creative side, I studied the business elements with particular intensity. I remembered enough from my family's conversations to understand profit margins, investment potential, and market trends. Tanner noticed my aptitude and began involving me in more significant decisions. "Most artists don't understand the business," he commented one night as we were calculating returns on a recent exhibition. "And most business people don't understand art. You seem to grasp both." "I've had good and bad teachers in both areas," I replied carefully. As months turned to years, I changed everything about myself. I dyed my naturally blonde hair dark brown. I legally changed my name from Elsie Harrington to Elsie Hayes, keeping only my first name as a private connection to my true self. I developed a new history for casual conversations, vague enough to avoid questions but detailed enough to seem authentic. By my 3rd year at Aperture, Tanner had promoted me to co-manager. The gallery was thriving and we were discussing expansion possibilities. Seattle's getting saturated, he said during a planning session. But Portland has an emerging scene with lower entry costs, and there's potential in smaller markets where collectors are underserved. I had been developing my own art again, secretly working in the small hours of the morning on a series that processed my trauma through abstract landscapes. I never displayed them or shared them with anyone. They were a private reclamation of the identity that had been stolen from me. When Tanner saw them accidentally one morning, arriving early and finding me still working, he was silent for a long moment. "These need to be shown," he finally said. "They're extraordinary." "I'm not ready," I told him. "I respect that," he nodded. "But when you are, they deserve to be seen." As our business partnership strengthened, Tanner offered me a profit-sharing arrangement that allowed me to build savings for the first time since my exile. I began investing carefully, applying lessons I had absorbed from my father, but with an ethical framework he had never possessed. My first small investment was in a tech startup founded by another gallery client. When it paid off 18 months later, I reinvested the proceeds in a diversified portfolio. By my 5th year away from home, I had accumulated enough capital to become a silent partner in Aperture's expansion to Portland. The new location succeeded beyond our projections, establishing a blueprint for further growth. Within 2 more years, we had galleries in 4 cities, with Tanner managing the creative direction while I handled much of the business strategy. Throughout this period of growth, I monitored my family from a distance. Through public records and business news, I tracked my father's company, Harrington Investments. What I discovered confirmed my original suspicions. The firm was showing classic signs of financial instability, selling off assets, reducing staff, and shifting to increasingly risky investment strategies. My father's criminal enterprise was beginning to crumble under its own weight, just as I had predicted it would 9 years earlier. Acting through an attorney and an LLC registered in Delaware, I began quietly purchasing properties in my hometown of Greenwich, Connecticut. My first acquisition was a small commercial building, 3 blocks from my father's office. Over the next 2 years, I added several more properties to my portfolio, including most significantly the historic Bellamy Hotel, a landmark venue where the city's elite held their most important events. All these transactions were conducted with complete anonymity. The local business community knew only that a successful West Coast investment group was taking interest in Greenwich real estate. While my financial resurrection progressed, I also built a network of friends and mentors who knew me only as Elsie Hayes, the talented gallery director with a keen business sense. People were drawn to my combination of artistic sensitivity and strategic thinking. For the first time in my life, I was valued for exactly who I was, not who someone else wanted me to be. One evening, as Tanner and I celebrated the 7th anniversary of Aperture's founding, he asked the question he had carefully avoided for years. "Who were you running from when we met, Elsie?" I considered deflecting, as I always had before. Instead, I told him a version of the truth. My family. They tried to destroy me because I threatened their perfect image. "Are you ready to stop running?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "You've been looking over your shoulder for 7 years, he said gently. Building success, but never fully claiming it. Always in the shadows. At some point, you have to decide if you're going to live your whole life in reaction to what they did, or if you're going to fully claim your own story. His words stayed with me. That night, I checked my family's social media profiles, something I did periodically to maintain awareness of their activities. A post from my sister caught my attention, a formal engagement announcement to Jeremy Caldwell, heir to Caldwell Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates on the East Coast. The celebration would be held at the Bellamy Hotel in 3 months, the Bellamy Hotel that I now owned. As I stared at the announcement, something shifted inside me. The frightened, betrayed young woman who had fled with nothing but a backpack had become someone new, someone stronger, wiser, and capable of confronting the past on her own terms. It was time to stop running. The discovery that my sister's engagement celebration would be held at my hotel felt like more than coincidence. It felt like an opportunity the universe had placed directly in my path. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine returning to Greenwich not as a victim seeking redemption, but as a woman of substance, claiming her rightful place. I needed more information before I could formulate a plan. Through my business contacts, I began discreetly gathering intelligence on my family's current situation. The picture that emerged confirmed my suspicions Harrington Investments was in serious trouble. My father had been approaching potential investors with increasingly desperate proposals, offering unrealistic returns that signaled a last-ditch effort to infuse capital into his failing enterprise. 3 major clients had withdrawn their portfolios in the past year, and rumors were circulating in financial circles about the firm's stability. The facade of success was cracking. I hired a private investigator to compile a comprehensive report on my father's business practices. The evidence confirmed what I had discovered 9 years earlier, but the situation had deteriorated significantly. His Ponzi scheme had grown more complex and more precarious. New client acquisition had slowed to a trickle, as the firm's reputation subtly declined. It was only a matter of time before the entire structure collapsed. This explained my sister's engagement to Jeremy Caldwell. The Caldwells were old money, 3 generations of manufacturing success with a fortune estimated in the billions. Such a connection would not only provide social reinforcement for the Harrington name, but potentially open doors to new investors who might extend my father's scheme a few more years. I needed a local contact, someone I could trust who knew the current social landscape. After careful consideration, I reached out to Madison Pierce, my closest childhood friend, before the family rift. Unlike others who had immediately accepted my family's narrative, Madison had simply faded from communication rather than actively rejecting me. It felt like a subtle but important distinction. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in New York City neutral territory, approximately halfway between our current locations. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Elsie, is it really you?" I nodded, uncertain of her reaction. "Thank you for meeting me, Madison. They said you died in an accident," she said, her voice hushed. "In Switzerland. A hiking tragedy. There was a memorial service, and everything." "Did you believe it?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not entirely. The timing was too convenient after everything else, and there were inconsistencies in the story. But I didn't know what to think." Over the next 2 hours, I shared the true story of what had happened 9 years ago. Madison listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to anger to resolve. "I always sensed something was wrong with their version," she said when I finished. "The Elsie I knew wasn't a thief or a liar. But they were so convincing, and when you disappeared completely, they made sure I disappeared." I corrected her. "They systematically cut off every path back." Madison had remained in Greenwich and maintained peripheral contact with my family through overlapping social circles. Her insights were invaluable. "Your family's standing has been slipping for years," she confirmed. "Nothing obvious, just a gradual cooling. Fewer invitations, more whispers. Your father still projects absolute confidence. But your mother—" She paused. "Caroline has changed. She rarely attends events anymore. When she does, she seems withdrawn, almost haunted." This information about my mother surprised me. She had always been my father's perfect partner in maintaining appearances. "And Audrey?" I asked. "Still, your father's daughter," Madison replied. "She runs the public-facing aspects of the business now, always impeccably dressed, perfectly poised. But this engagement has an air of desperation about it. The Caldwells are several social tiers above, even the Harringtons at their peak." I shared my discovery that the engagement celebration would be at the Bellamy, which I now owned. Madison's eyes widened. That's perfect. But what exactly are you planning, Elsie?" "Not revenge," I said, surprising myself with the realization as I spoke it. "Justice. Truth. I want them to face what they did. Not just to me, but to all the clients they've defrauded. I want to reclaim my name and my history." In the weeks that followed, I meticulously crafted my approach. I gathered documentation of my father's financial crimes, authenticated by forensic accountants. I assembled evidence of my family's deliberate campaign to erase and defame me. I prepared records of my own business, success, and ethical investments. As the date of the engagement party approached, I made arrangements to be in Greenwich a week early, staying in a private suite at the Bellamy, under my legal name Elsie Hayes. I used this time to reconnect with the city I had once called home, and to ensure every detail of my plan was in place. Tanner flew in 3 days before the event. He had been my sounding board throughout the planning process, consistently challenging me to examine my true motives. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he asked, as we walked through the hotel's grand ballroom where the celebration would be held. "Once you step into that room on Saturday, there's no going back." "I've been living in a half-life for 9 years," I replied, always looking over my shoulder, always hiding some essential part of myself. "I need to face them not just for justice, but for my own healing. Just promise me something," he said, stopping to face me directly. "Remember that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's living well, on your own terms." The night before the engagement party, I received an unexpected call from Madison. "There's something you should know," she said without preamble. "I ran into your mother at the pharmacy today. She didn't recognize me at first. She seemed disoriented. When I greeted her, she clutched my arm and asked if I'd heard from you recently." "What?" The information stunned me. "She knows. I'm supposedly dead." "Exactly," Madison continued. When I reminded her of that, she just stared at me and said, "Of course, the accident." I forgot for a moment. "Elsie, I think your mother might be having some kind of breakdown. She's been filling prescriptions for antidepressants and anxiety medication for years, according to my cousin who works there." This revelation forced me to reconsider aspects of my approach. If my mother was suffering from depression and possibly regret it, added a dimension I hadn't accounted for. My goal had never been to destroy my family, only to expose the truth and reclaim my identity. Perhaps there was more potential for reconciliation than I had allowed myself to imagine. The final piece of information came that same evening from my private investigator, a startling discovery about Jeremy Caldwell, Audrey's fiancé. His father, Robert Caldwell, had been one of my father's clients 15 years earlier. They had parted ways under circumstances that suggested Robert had narrowly avoided being victimized by my father's schemes. This connection couldn't be coincidental. Was Jeremy aware of his father's history with Harrington Investments? Was his interest in Audrey genuinely romantic? Or did he have other motives? These new insights complicated my plan, but they also enriched it. Justice wasn't as simple as exposure and condemnation. True justice would need to account for the complex human realities behind the betrayal, including the possibility that not everyone in my family had been equally complicit or remained unchanged over the years. As I laid out my outfit for the following evening, an elegant but understated black dress that projected confidence and success, I found myself hoping for something I hadn't dared to consider before. Not just vindication, but the possibility, however, remote, of healing. The Bellamy Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and elegant floral arrangements. Champagne flowed as Greenwich's elite gathered to celebrate my sister's engagement to Jeremy Caldwell. From my vantage point in an adjoining room where I could observe unnoticed, I watched the familiar choreography of wealth and status air kisses, strategic conversations, the careful positioning for advantage that had been the backdrop of my childhood. My family stood near the entrance, greeting guests with practiced charm. My father, William, looked older than his 58 years, with new lines of strain visible even from a distance. My mother, Caroline, maintained her perfect posture and smile, but I could see the effort it required. And Audrey, my sister, wore her triumph openly radiant in a designer gown beside her tall, distinguished fiancé. I had arranged with the hotel manager, who reported directly to my management company, to be notified when all key guests had arrived. At precisely the right moment, he approached with a subtle nod. "It's time, Miss Hayes." Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the ballroom. The familiar faces, the room, the entire scene, it all felt surreal after 9 years of exile. I moved deliberately toward my family, aware of curious glances from guests who didn't recognize me. My mother noticed me first. Her champagne glass froze halfway to her lips, her eyes widening in shock that quickly transformed to horror. "Why is this failure here?" she snapped loudly enough for nearby guests to turn. My sister's reaction came next. A disbelieving stare followed by a dismissive smirk. "You are not on the guest list." she said coldly, her voice carrying in the sudden pocket of silence that had formed around us. My father's response was perhaps the most cutting. He simply looked through me, past me, his gaze, deliberately focusing on a point beyond my shoulder, as if I were invisible. A ghost at his daughter's perfect celebration. I had prepared for this moment for weeks, rehearsed what I would say, how I would maintain my composure. Still, the wall of rejection hit with physical force. For a flashing instant, I was 22 again, betrayed and abandoned by the people who should have protected me. But I wasn't that person anymore. I smiled confidently, meeting each of their gazes in turn. I'm not here to cause trouble, I said clearly. I'm here because I own the venue now, and there's something all of you need to know. The statement landed like a stone in still water, ripples of shock spreading outward. My father's careful mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine confusion before he recovered. Security, he called sharply to a nearby uniformed staff member. This woman is trespassing and making absurd claims. Please remove her. The security officer looked uncertainly between us. Sir Miss Hayes is the owner of the Bellamy. We received specific instructions regarding tonight's event. My father's complexion darkened dangerously. This is Elsie Harrington, my disturbed daughter, who we lost contact with years ago. Whatever she's told you is a fabrication. Actually, I replied, opening the small portfolio I carried. I'm Elsie Hayes, now legally changed, after I was forced to rebuild my life from nothing. I removed several documents and handed them to my father. Here are the ownership papers for the Bellamy Hotel, along with documentation of my current business holdings, including a successful gallery chain with locations in 6 cities. Guests were openly staring now, conversations suspended as the drama unfolded. Audrey stepped forward, her composed facade cracking. How dare you show up like this? She hissed. Do you have any idea what you're ruining? I think she knows exactly what she's doing. Came a new voice, Jeremy Caldwell, who had been observing the exchange with intense interest. Unlike the others, he didn't appear angry or shocked. If anything, he seemed intrigued. Mr. Caldwell, I acknowledged him with a slight nod. I apologize for the disruption to your celebration. No apology necessary, he replied smoothly. I find family reunions fascinating, especially unexpected ones. My father attempted to regain control of the situation. Jeremy, I'm terribly sorry about this intrusion. Elsie has always struggled with reality. We'll have her removed immediately and continue with our evening. Before anyone removes me, I said, raising my voice slightly so it carried through the now silent ballroom. I think the guests deserve to know why I've been absent for 9 years and why my family has been telling people I died in a hiking accident. The murmurs that followed confirmed what Madison had told me. My death had become part of local lore. 9 years ago, I discovered that my father was running an elaborate Ponzi scheme through Harrington Investments. I continued, my voice steady. When I confronted him and threatened to report the illegal activity, my family framed me for theft, destroyed my reputation, canceled my scholarship, and effectively erased my existence. I withdrew more documents from my portfolio, financial records, forensic accounting reports, and evidence of the deliberate campaign to discredit me. I was 22 years old when my family decided I was more valuable erased than included. I spent months homeless before rebuilding my life from absolute zero. I gestured to the room around us. I now own this hotel along with several other properties in Greenwich, all purchased legitimately through my success in the art world and ethical investments, the kind that don't steal from clients. The silence in the room was deafening. My father finally broke it, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. These are malicious lies from a disturbed mind, he shouted, losing the composure he'd maintained through decades of business dealings. She's always been unstable, jealous of her sister's success. We tried everything, therapy, medication, but she chose to run away rather than accept help. And now she returns with these fabrications to ruin her sister's happiness. His outburst achieved what my careful presentation alone might not have: absolute credibility. No one in Greenwich society had ever seen William Harrington lose control. His reputation had been built on unshakable poise and authority. The spectacle of him shouting, red-faced and defensive, confirmed that something significant lay beneath my allegations. Jeremy Caldwell stepped forward again, positioning himself slightly apart from my family. Actually, he said, in the measured tone of someone choosing his words with extreme care. "I find Miss Hayes's account quite credible. You see, my father was briefly a client of Harrington Investments about 15 years ago. He withdrew his funds. Rather abruptly, didn't he, William?" My father's face drained of color. Jeremy continued. "In fact, my interest in your daughter was never solely romantic. The Caldwell family has been monitoring Harrington Investments for some time, concerned about certain patterns we've observed. This engagement provided a convenient opportunity for closer access." The revelation struck like lightning. Audrey gasped, her perfect composure finally shattering completely. "You were investigating us." "This whole time," she whispered. "Not initially," Jeremy replied, with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Initially, I was simply curious about the family behind a potentially fraudulent investment firm. But I did come to care for you, Audrey. I had hoped you might not be involved in your father's activities. She has been his primary accomplice for years," I said quietly. "While I was sleeping in shelters, she was helping maintain the fiction that allowed the scheme to continue." Guests began edging toward the exits, murmuring among themselves. The celebration had transformed into a spectacular public implosion of one of Greenwich's most prominent families. No one wanted to be too closely associated with what was unfolding. In that moment, as my carefully constructed plan achieved exactly what I had intended, I felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for all that had been lost, all the years and relationships destroyed by greed and lies. Within 20 minutes, the ballroom had emptied of all but the most essential participants in the unfolding drama. Those who remained stood in small, tense clusters. My family, Jeremy and his parents, who had been summoned from elsewhere in the hotel, Madison, who had arrived as planned to provide moral support, Tanner, who observed from a respectful distance, and several shocked family friends, too, invested in the situation to discreetly exit. The music had stopped. Half-empty champagne glasses littered abandoned tables. The celebration had transformed into something entirely different, a reckoning. "I think perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more private," Robert Caldwell suggested, his authoritative tone, brooking no argument. We moved to a conference room adjacent to the ballroom. The hotel manager, responding to my earlier instructions, had prepared it with water, coffee, and seating for just such a contingency. As we settled around the large oak table, Audrey suddenly broke. The perfect composure she had maintained for years cracked completely, tears streaming down her face. "Is it true?" she demanded, looking at our father. "Was Elsie right about the business? Have you been running a Ponzi scheme all these years?" My father's expression hardened. "This is hardly the time or place." "It's exactly the time," Audrey interrupted, her voice rising. "Our family is imploding in public. My engagement is revealed as a fraud. I deserve to know if everything I've built my life around is a lie, too." William Harrington had built his career on projecting absolute confidence. Even when cornered, he had always found a path to assert control. But the combined weight of my return, Jeremy's revelation, and his daughter's demands finally proved too much. His shoulders sagged visibly. "The market's changed," he said quietly. "After the financial crisis, nothing worked like it used to. I had to be creative to maintain returns for our legacy clients." "Creative," Robert Caldwell repeated flatly. "Is that what we're calling financial fraud now?" My mother, who had remained silent through the public confrontation, suddenly spoke. "I always knew," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not the details, but I knew something wasn't right. The way you'd check account balances in the middle of the night, the secret phone calls, the growing anxiety each quarter." She turned to me, really looking at me for the first time. "I told myself you were wrong, that you didn't understand business at that level. I chose to believe that because the alternative was unthinkable." Her eyes filled with tears. "I failed you completely, Elsie. I let them drive you away, rather than face the truth." Her admission stunned me. In all my planning for this moment, I had imagined many possible reactions, but genuine remorse from my mother hadn't been among them. "You knew I was innocent," I said, the realization landing heavily. "You knew, and you let them destroy my life anyway. I was a coward, she whispered. I've been paying for it every day since. The pills only dull the edges. They don't erase the knowledge of what I did to my own daughter. Jeremy stood suddenly. I need to make some calls. This situation has evolved beyond a family matter. He looked directly at my father. Financial crimes of this magnitude require proper authorities. Wait, I said, surprising myself. Before we involve authorities, there's something else you should know. I retrieved another folder from my portfolio and placed it on the table. This contains documentation of a restitution fund I've established for the victims of Harrington investments. I've been building it for 3 years, setting aside significant portions of my legitimate business profits to eventually make whole those who were defrauded. The room fell silent. You did what my father asked incredulously. I created a fund to repay the people you stole from, I repeated. Not because I was responsible, but because someone needed to take responsibility. I've been working with financial forensics experts to identify victims and quantify losses. Audrey stared at me with dawning comprehension. You could have just exposed him, watched him go to prison, and the business collapse. Why would you try to save the victims? Because this was never about revenge, I said simply. This was about truth and justice. Those people trusted our family with their financial futures. They deserved better than what they received. Robert Caldwell studied me with newfound respect. That's a remarkably ethical position, Miss Hayes, but the fund would need to be substantial to address the full scope of the fraud. It currently holds $22 million, I replied. Not enough to cover all losses, but a significant start. With the cooperation of the Harrington family assets, including this property I gestured to indicate the hotel around us, we could potentially make most victims whole without criminal proceedings. Jeremy exchanged a look with his father. That's an interesting proposal, though certain regulatory requirements would still apply. My father, who had been watching this exchange with growing disbelief, suddenly found his voice. You would do this? After what we did to you? He seemed unable to comprehend my actions. I'm not doing it for you, I clarified. I'm doing it because it's right, and because carrying hatred for 9 years was destroying me from within. I needed to find a better way forward. As the implications of my proposal sank in, the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. The raw anger and shock began to give way to something more contemplative. We weren't just witnessing the collapse of a family facade. We were potentially finding a path toward resolution that served justice without destruction. Audrey rose unsteadily from her chair and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened gardens beyond. After a long moment, she turned back to face me. I knew you were innocent, she admitted, her voice breaking. I knew Dad was doing something wrong with the business. I was scared of losing everything: our status, our wealth, my future. I told myself you would land on your feet because you were always so strong and independent. She wiped at her tears. I never imagined what would really happen to you. I never let myself think about it. Her confession hung in the air between us. 9 years of complicity finally acknowledged. We declared you dead. She continued, unable to stop now that the truth had begun to emerge. It was Dad's idea. People were still asking questions about where you'd gone, why you'd left so suddenly. The story about Switzerland made it final. No one would keep asking about a tragedy. I had thought myself prepared for anything this confrontation might bring, but the pain of hearing the calculated nature of my erasure still cut deeply. Did you ever think about trying to find me? I asked. Did you ever wonder if I was okay? At first I forced myself not to think about you at all, Audrey confessed. It was the only way I could live with what we'd done. But these last few years, she trailed off, then steadied herself. I hired a private investigator 2 years ago. He couldn't find any trace of Elsie Harrington. I didn't know you'd changed your name. This revelation startled me. While I had been monitoring my family from afar, Audrey had apparently been conducting her own search. I was going to use some of the money from marrying Jeremy to keep looking, she added softly. I told myself that once I had my own security, I would find you and try to make amends somehow. Jeremy, who had been observing this exchange, shook his head slightly. I'm afraid that security was never going to materialize, Audrey. Once my investigation confirmed your family's financial improprieties, the engagement would have ended. So it really was all a lie, she said hollowly. Everything. Not everything, he replied with unexpected gentleness. My interest in you became genuine, even as my concerns about your family's business practices were confirmed. I had hoped you might be an unwitting participant rather than an active one. Madison, who had remained a silent witness until now, stepped forward. I think what we're seeing here is that everyone was trapped in different ways by the original lies. Some more culpable than others, but all damaged by the deceptions. Tanner nodded in agreement. The question now is whether healing is possible. Not forgetting or erasing the past, but finding a way forward that acknowledges the harm done while creating space for something new. As the night progressed, the conversation continued painful, honest, and necessary. Representatives from the SEC would need to be involved. The Caldwell's legal team would help structure the restitution process. The public narrative would require careful management to protect innocent parties while ensuring transparency about the fraud. By dawn, exhausted but clear-eyed, we had outlined a framework for accountability that balanced justice with the possibility of redemption. My father would face significant consequences, including the loss of his professional licenses and substantial financial penalties. The company would be dissolved, its legitimate assets folded into the restitution fund, but criminal charges might be mitigated by full cooperation and the substantial restitution already established. My mother would enter treatment for her depression. Audrey would need to rebuild her life and career from a much humbler starting point. As for me, I had come seeking justice and reclamation of my truth. I had achieved that, though not in the way I had anticipated. The stark confrontation I had imagined had evolved into something more nuanced, a painful but potentially healing excavation of years of lies and self-deception. When we finally emerged from the conference room, the first light of morning was streaming through the hotel's eastern windows. Nothing had been fully resolved, but everything had been irrevocably changed. The carefully constructed facade of Harrington family perfection had crumbled, completely revealing the broken human reality beneath. And in that broken reality paradoxically lay the first possibility of authentic connection in nearly a decade. 3 months after the dramatic confrontation at the Bellamy Hotel, I stood in the entrance hall of what had once been my childhood home. The grand colonial mansion felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, the physical structure unchanged, but the atmosphere entirely different. My father was awaiting the outcome of negotiations with regulatory authorities. The family's financial assets had been largely liquidated to contribute to the restitution fund, which had grown to nearly $50 million. The mansion itself would soon be sold with proceeds directed to the fund. I had returned at my mother's invitation. After 2 months of intensive treatment for depression at a residential facility, she had asked to meet with me privately. She greeted me at the door herself. No household staff remained, looking both older and somehow more authentic than the perfectly controlled woman of my memory. Her designer clothes had been replaced by simple slacks and a sweater. Her hair, once meticulously colored and styled, now showed strands of natural gray. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar humility. "Would you like some tea?" We sat in the sunroom, once the setting for her carefully orchestrated charity committee meetings. Now it was just a room with comfortable furniture and morning light. "The therapists say I used external validation to avoid confronting my own emptiness," she said, after we had exchanged awkward pleasantries. Status appearances, social position. They were all ways of not looking at the void inside. She met my eyes directly. "I sacrificed my daughter to protect a life that wasn't even making me happy." "Why did you stay with him?" I asked. "After you knew what he was doing." She considered the question carefully. "Fear at first, then habit, then shame. The longer you participate in a lie, the more impossible it seems to escape it. Your entire identity becomes wrapped in maintaining the fiction." She paused. "I'm not making excuses. Just trying to understand it myself." "Are you happier now?" I asked, genuinely curious. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Happier? No, not exactly, but more." real, more present. The medication helps with the worst of the depression. And facing the truth, however, painful is better than drowning in lies. She looked around the sunroom. I won't miss this house, you know. It was always more showcase than home. We talked for over 2 hours. Really talked, perhaps for the first time in our lives. She asked about my years in Seattle, my work with the galleries, my development as an artist. I shared parts of my journey, including the lowest points of homelessness and despair. She listened without defensive deflection, occasionally wiping away tears. I'd like to have a relationship with you, Elsie, she said as our conversation drew to a close. Not as mother and daughter in the traditional sense. I forfeited that right, but perhaps as two women finding a new way forward. Would that be possible, do you think? I don't know, I answered honestly, but I'm willing to explore it. 2 days later, I met with Audrey at a small cafe downtown. Unlike our mother, she remained visibly tense, her composure brittle. I've been offered a position teaching basic finance at the community college, she told me after we ordered coffee. It's a tremendous step down, obviously. It's honest work, I replied. That has value. She nodded, slowly absorbing this perspective. Jeremy still calls occasionally, she added. Not romantically, but he's been surprisingly decent about everything. His father's company has hired some of our former employees who had no knowledge of the fraud. The Caldwells understand the distinction between justice and vengeance, I observed. That's rare. Audrey studied me with new awareness. You understand it too. That restitution fund. I still can't believe you did that. It felt like the only way to truly break the cycle, I explained. To respond to wrongdoing with something constructive rather than destructive. She was quiet for a moment. I'd like to contribute somehow. I don't have money, obviously, but perhaps I could help with administration or documentation. Try to make amends in some small way. I'll connect you with the forensic accountants handling the distributions, I said. They could probably use someone who understands the firm's history. As our conversation continued, I suggested something that had been forming in my mind. The mansion will be sold soon. Before that happens, I'd like to convert it temporarily into an art center for underprivileged youth. A 6-month program before the new owners take possession. Audrey looked surprised. An art center. In that stuffy old place. Why not? All those formal rooms transformed into studios and galleries. It would be a powerful symbol of transformation. A hint of her old decisive energy returned. I could help organize it. I still know everyone in town despite everything. We could get donations of supplies, volunteers to teach. We, I asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated, then met my gaze directly. If you'll have me as a partner in the project, I know I have a lot to make up for. The Harrington Youth Art Initiative launched 2 weeks later. Madison came on board to help coordinate programming, drawing on her connections in the local education system. The formal dining room where I had endured countless silent, judgmental family dinners became a vibrant painting studio. The library transformed into a digital media lab. The conservative living room now housed sculpture and 3-dimensional art projects. Children from neighborhoods that had never been invited into Greenwich's elite homes now filled the mansion with creative energy, laughter, and occasional artistic chaos. The irony of this transformation was not lost on any of us, least of all my father, who observed the changes with resigned bewilderment during his brief court-approved visits home. Meanwhile, I maintained my business responsibilities with the gallery chain now operating under a new name, Aperture Collective, with Tanner and I as equal partners. Our Seattle flagship location hosted a special exhibition that autumn, Erasure and Reclamation, featuring my personal works created during the years of exile. The series documented my journey from trauma through resilience to rebuilding. Tanner attended the opening reception, proudly watching, as critics and collectors engaged deeply with the powerful abstract landscapes that charted my emotional territory. You've closed the circle, he observed, as we shared a quiet moment away from the crowd. The promising young artist who was interrupted has finally emerged stronger for the journey. Not closed, I corrected him. Transformed. Circles repeat. Spirals evolve. When the 6-month youth program concluded, I sold the Bellamy Hotel and several other Greenwich properties I had acquired. The proceeds were split between the restitution fund and a newly established foundation supporting arts education for underserved communities. The mansion itself was purchased by a nonprofit educational organization that would continue operating programs similar to what we had established. The formal Harrington name was removed from the property, replaced simply with the Greenwich Community Arts Center. On my final visit before returning to Seattle, I walked through the empty rooms of my childhood home. The space felt lighter, somehow cleared of the oppressive weight of appearances and expectations that had defined the Harrington family existence. In the entrance hall, I found Madison and Audrey waiting to say goodbye. "Will you come back to visit?" Madison asked, hugging me tightly. "Definitely," I promised. "This place is part of my story now, the whole story, not just the painful chapters." Audrey approached more hesitantly. Our relationship remained complicated, the damage not so easily repaired. But something new was gradually emerging from the wreckage of our past. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me another way to live." 1 year after the confrontation that had changed everything, I hosted an exhibition at our Portland gallery titled Family Reconstructed. The centerpiece was a multimedia installation that told the story of abandonment, erasure, and the painful but necessary process of rebuilding authentic connections. Visitors moved through the exhibition space, experiencing the emotional journey from betrayal to tentative healing. The final room contained a single painting, a portrait of 3 women at different stages of transformation, separate but connected by subtle threads of color and light. My mother attended the opening, her first trip outside New England in decades. Audrey came too, now working full-time with the Restitution Fund while studying for a degree in nonprofit management. They stood together viewing the portrait, recognizing themselves in my artistic interpretation. "You've depicted us with such compassion," my mother observed, her voice thick with emotion. "More than we deserved." "Art isn't about what people deserve," I replied. "It's about truth. And the truth is never as simple as villains and heroes. We're all just humans trying to find our way forward." As I looked around the gallery filled with people engaging with my most personal work, I reflected on the long, painful journey that had led to this moment. The frightened, betrayed young woman who had fled Greenwich with nothing but a backpack had found her voice, her strength, and ultimately a deeper understanding of both justice and forgiveness. True family, I had learned, wasn't defined by blood ties or shared last names. It was built through honesty, support, and the courage to face difficult truths together. My journey had made me stronger, more compassionate, and ultimately more whole than I could have imagined 9 years earlier when my world collapsed. Sometimes it takes being completely erased to discover who you truly are. Thank you for joining me on this journey of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after a devastating setback? How did you find the strength to move forward? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with others who might find hope in knowing that even after being abandoned and erased, we can create beautiful new beginnings. Until next time, remember that your worth isn't determined by those who reject you, but by the truth you honor and the life you choose to build.